From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Ted Nesi will join me on the second half. Keeping government running during a pandemic, and I suppose outside a pandemic as well, that is the job of our guest this week. Joining me now live from the State House is the Director of the Department of Administration, Brett Smiley. Director, it's good to speak with you.
You too, Tim. Thanks.
So let's start with the direct impact of COVID-19 on state government. So our viewers understand, as the Director of the Department of Administration, you run the executive branch of government, not judicial and legislative. And as we talk about this, these figures don't include all of government, including state colleges and universities. But it was reported earlier this week that 20 state employees in the executive branch tested positive for the virus. Where does that stand as of Friday morning?
So that number is up to about 40 now. We get daily reports on state employees, and we monitor it and make sure that we're doing everything we can to keep their colleagues and really everyone in state government as safe as possible.
And what has been the impact on the ability for the government to function in terms of course, those 40 people out sick, but I'm sure you have a number of people who aren't working because they're on quarantine?
Yeah, we have over 200 employees on quarantine as well, but in spite of that, we have been able to keep state government open and running well. Now more than ever, state government matters in the lives of real Rhode Islanders. You know, our state employees are the people that are processing these unemployment checks. They're ones that are processing emergency funding for families hardest hit, like TANF and SNAP benefits. And so, despite the challenges that we're facing, like every employer, but as the state's largest employer, we have contingency plans in place, and we've put measures in place to keep our employees safe, but we remain open for business, and open for business at a more important time than ever, frankly.
Not to be flip, but state government doesn't have a great track record with technology. How has the transition to remote working, which I'm hearing there are a lot of state employees who are working from home, how has that transition been so far?
You know, if there's a silver lining, at least as it pertains to state employment and the state workforce, has been our quick adaptation to the 21st century. Sometimes state government does feel like it's a couple decades behind, but we have moved rapidly to both enable and empower employees to work remotely, but then also to work in new ways. And so we have over 2,000 state employees who are teleworking. We've deployed hundreds of new laptops and other devices. We've had to make systemic upgrades to things like our VPN and our firewall and our security and our technology. And we've been able to make some really rapid and significant changes. So, you know, for example, we stood up the DOH crisis call line in a weekend. This was a call center that didn't exist. We needed to start answering people's questions quickly. Over the course of a weekend, we turned that around. We have people working in virtual call centers now at home to help get through some of these backlogs. We've converted window service to call centers. We've gone to an all-reservation system at the DMV. I mean, these are things that normally would have taken us months or maybe even years in some cases, that we've been able to turn around in days and weeks. And so it's really a testament to the resilience of our workforce and the hard work of the Department of IT, who falls under the Director of Administration. It's been inspiring to see the changes.
That kind of technology that you had to upgrade for state government usually takes, as you point out, takes forever, but it's got to go out to bid because it's not cheap. You talked about 2,000 state workers that are teleworking right now, hundreds of laptops sent home. You had to upgrade networks. You also have to take care of security with those networks. Is the federal government going to pay for those upgrades? How is Rhode Island footing that bill?
Sure. Yeah, we believe all of those expenses will be reimbursable by the feds. There is already a FEMA disaster declaration in place, which means that most expenses are eligible for 75% reimbursement from the federal government. We're continuing to advocate with the White House and with FEMA through our delegation to make that 100% so that there's no local share. Additionally, there's other stimulus funds and COVID-related funds coming from the federal government that might be able to make up that difference. But at the end of the day, all of it will be reimbursed.
I want to get more into the funding coming from federal government and the possible strings attached. But first, I think there are a lot of state employees who are watching this right now, listening to the director of the Department of Administration and wondering, is the state considering furloughs or layoffs?
Yeah, we've gotten that question a couple times, and the answer is that's the last thing we want to do. We are taking a variety of steps to balance and manage our budget at an extraordinarily difficult time. And so almost at the outset of this crisis, we implemented a hiring freeze for all non-COVID related hires. We implemented a spending freeze for anything that wasn't directly responsive to the crisis. We are working closely with our unions to ask for additional flexibility and cooperation. You know, as an example, our sheriffs, as you know, the court system is open for emergency business only, and so many of those sheriffs were idle. They have been redeployed and are screening state employees at state buildings. And so long as we can continue to get flexibility and cooperation to deploy state employees and, frankly, other state help to where it's most needed, those are the kind of actions that we can take in order to try to defer and ultimately, hopefully, never have to talk about furloughs.
When do you get a better understanding of when you might have to talk about furloughs? Actually, let me ask it in a different way so our viewers understand or might remember you were Chief of Staff for Governor Gina Raimondo before transitioning to Director of the DOA in mid-January, I believe that happened. Talk about baptism by fire for you, Director.
Right.
At what point do you does the fiscal year ending in just over 2 months, when does a governor need to think about getting with legislative leaders to rework the budget and really get her arms around where things stand financially for the state?
Well, the governor and our office and the budget office has been in regular communication with legislative leaders. That's not something that we've deferred. We've been in constant conversations with them. The Revenue and Estimating Conference, which Rhode Islanders may or may not know, is a twice-a-year event where we look at future economic forecasts and make a decision on where we think state revenues will be. That's happening soon. This year, it's going to be a very difficult task because we're going to be looking at predictions in terms of what things like wage growth will look like and income growth that I don't think any of the smartest economies in the world right now know exactly how that's going to sort out. So we will be working closely together with the legislature in the coming weeks, and one way or another, we still need to pass a new state budget by the end of June.
Director, let's get back to that federal money we talked about earlier. And what is your understanding of what kind of strings are attached to the federal emergency money? And just to give you an example to start our conversation on this, many schools and towns may be wondering, all right, look, we've been in remote learning. Can I use this disaster aid to fund the schools because it was impacted by COVID-19? Can you answer that question yet?
I could answer some of that question. We don't know all the details yet. The federal government has provided to the states a variety of streams of funding. And again, a big credit. The governor is always forward about this, and I want to also say thank you to Senator Reid and White House, Congressman Cicilline and Langevin, because we have about $1.5 billion in federal aid finding its way to Rhode Island right now. And a majority of that is coming in the form of what's called the Corona Relief Fund, which is $1.25 billion coming to the state to help mitigate the expenses incurred from this crisis. Those details on how we're allowed to spend those rules are rather limited at the moment, and we expect more details in the coming weeks. However, to your question about the schools, it's clear to us that if a school department had to buy technology or a Wi-Fi hotspot, that's an expense that would not have occurred but for this crisis, and we're pretty confident that'll be reimbursable. Whether teacher salaries or administrator salaries are eligible, we don't know the answer to that yet, and we have to wait for the federal guidance.
Are you hoping that there might be another round of federal money to help pay the bills for these cities and towns, and I suppose state government that might be a little bit looser on the requirements for those funding streams, because the state budget is going to be tight. We don't need the revenue conference to tell us that, and certainly cities and towns We saw the recession 10 years ago, the impact that had on their budgets. Are you hoping there might be some loosening of those restrictions?
Yeah, we're advocating both for maximum flexibility with the existing funds and then also for future stimulus packages. It has been made clear to us that the current funds can't be used to replace lost state revenues, and so we're looking for that in a future round. But at the same note, we also are trying to wrap our heads around the extent of the need. I mean, we've seen the press about how quickly the SBA lending program filled up, or the Goldman Sachs lending program. The relief funds that have been awarded to the state aren't meant to just backfill state revenue or meet the state's needs. We need to meet all of Rhode Island's needs, and so some of those funds need to go to helping those hurt the hardest through this crisis. And those are real Rhode Islanders who are facing significant challenges that we're constantly thinking about first, as we also have to do things like balance the state budget.
Director, you brought up some of the programs that are out there to help small businesses, and I want to touch on that a little bit. Weeks ago, we launched something here at Channel 12 called 12 Responds for people to email in their questions or concerns, and I can tell you we've gotten thousands of people writing in, which really speaks to how many people are hurting out there. And I wanted to pose one of the questions we got to you. Paul wrote in, he asked us about small businesses and license renewals. He says many license fees and renewals have been waived or extended due to the virus, but not all, and he referenced in his email to us a $2,000 fee he owes. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of Paul's exact situation, because I do not have all of his details, broadly speaking, are you giving these businesses a break when it comes to licensing fees and renewal dates?
I would say, again, yes, without knowing the details, broadly speaking, all of our departments and agencies are trying to be as flexible and understanding as possible. I remember not too long ago when we it was actually only a couple weeks ago, although it feels like a lifetime ago, when we made the really difficult decision to close restaurants, and there was a tax payment due, and at the time we talked about a provision where they could file for a hardship, and that the Division of Tax would take every step possible to try to be cooperative and flexible in the granting of some hardship waivers, and that's the general philosophy that's found throughout government right now. We know what kind of stress and pain Rhode Islanders are under, and as it comes to licensing fees and permit fees, many of them have been waived or extended, and folks who are on the front line dealing with customers are doing their best to try to be understanding of Rhode Islanders in their time of need.
Sounds like Paul should pick up the phone and call DBR or whatever agency to find out if they will give him, will cut him a little bit of a break on this situation. Is that your advice to him?
Again, not knowing any of the details, whoever is issuing that license, he should call that department and see what can be worked out.
All right, Director, we have just about a minute left. This is master the obvious here. The country is going to be very different when we come out of this, and certainly state government will as well. Is there a learning experience from all of this where some of maybe the technology or the things that you've had to implement during this crisis will be carried over to when things click back to normal?
I think so. The governor referenced it yesterday in her press conference that we have a whole work stream called the New Normal, where we're trying to get ahead of what work is going to look like as we start to reopen the economy. That pertains to state government as well. So, for example, down at the DMV, we have our staff split into two teams, and one team comes in one day and the other team comes in the next day, and they telework the day they're not in the office in order to enable better social distancing and spread out a little bit more. I think strategies like that might persist for some time, and so through baptism by fire, we've had to make some accommodations and some changes, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of them are sustained for months to come. We are an employer like many other employers. We're state government, but we also employ thousands of people, and so we're going to have to make some changes to the way we do business, and we're trying to prepare for that like everyone else.
Director of the Department of Administration, Brett Smiley, my sincere thanks to you for your time. I know you're extremely busy. When we come back, we go back to the State House. My colleague Ted Nesi, we take a look at a week in news, including some pretty scary projections from the governor this week. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers.